Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Abby Lester, and I'm the director of the JDC Global Archives. I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture by Brenna Miller. This is the third program in our webinar series, Across Oceans, Across Cultures, Jewish Refuge in East Asia, and the Role of JDC. Before we start the program, I'd like to share a few words about the archives. We hold the organizational history of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint. Our collections include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. And given the role that JDC has played in Jewish lives around the world since 1914, our archives reflect not only the history of the organization, but also the history of world Jewry in the 20th and 21st centuries. The archives operates out of both New York and Jerusalem, and scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, genealogists, curators, filmmakers, and others. To support scholarly research in our collections, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. One of these fellowships is the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship. It was established in 2012 in honor of Ellen Lewis, a German Jewish refugee who worked for JDC in Shanghai and later in New York. Our speaker today, Brenna Miller, received the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship for 2025. Brenna is a PhD student in musicology at the Ohio State University School of Music. She received a Bachelor of Music in Woodwind Performance and a Bachelor of Arts in English from Florida State University. She has held fellowships at the Ohio State University and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and has received grants from the American Musicological Society, Ohio State University's Melton Center for Jewish Studies, and the Ohio State University East Asian Study Center. Brenna Miller will now start her lecture.
First, I'd like to start with a couple of thank yous because many organizations, people, and committees have made it possible for me to be here today. I'd like to thank the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for their initial support of my research. My time as a summer graduate fellow allowed me to see the potential of this project as I went through archival boxes and online databases. I'd also like to thank Ohio State University's many, many departments that have funded research trips over the last 3 years, especially the musicology area, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Melton Center for Jewish Studies. And finally, I'd like to thank the JDC for supporting this project during the 2025 to 2026 academic year, and of course, for hosting me today. The support from the archive staff has been fantastic as this project has grown and developed. And with that, let's begin. When you think about aid during and after the Holocaust, maybe you think of international organizations like the JDC. Maybe you think of large crates marked with a country like USA. Or maybe you think of sterile bureaucratic offices issuing passports and visas. You would be right. These were all important forms of aid for refugees and victims of the Holocaust. International aid also assisted Jewish survivors in displaced persons camps by providing food, clothing, and religious supplies. Aid took and continues to take many shapes and forms, constantly adapting to the needs of refugees as international and political situations change from day to day. The goal of humanitarian aid is to save lives and relieve suffering, immediately providing relief to people who need resources that they cannot pay for or physically access. The inflow of material aid, though, leads to indirect outcomes within communities, one of which is music and the arts. Although musical ventures are rarely the primary recipients of funds and resources, musical communities emerge and, at times, flourish during crises when people's material needs are met. To examine how aid and music intertwine, we'll focus on the Central European Jewish refugee community in Shanghai, China, during and after World War II. Between 1938 and 1941, around 20,000 European Jews fled an increasingly dangerous Europe to Shanghai. Because Shanghai required no entry visa or passport, it became one of the last open ports for refugees. Many arrived via Italian ocean liner, marking a month-long journey through the Suez Canal and along the Indian coastline, as you can see here on this map from the SS Conteverde. A few others arrived by train through Siberia. Because of the sheer number of refugees who were unable to bring resources from their home countries of Germany and Austria, aid was urgently needed and quickly supplied. In a 1940 report from the largely JDC-funded Committee for the Assistance of European Jewish Refugees in Shanghai, aid took the form of the monetary support of hospitals, housing rentals, loans, schooling, and vocational training. The organization also funded immigration, burial needs, and an arbitration board, all institutions deemed necessary for a functional community. Music, however, is notably absent from this report, and it was not considered vocational training. If one were to simply read this report, it may lead one to believe that music and aid had no relationship here. While it is true that music was not directly funded, it would be untrue to say that these two things are unrelated. Today, I'll invite you to consider two different ways that aid and music influence one another. First, musicians who could get to Shanghai were able to maintain employment when many others in skilled trades and professions could not. Because of this, musicians were able to make room for more of their fellow refugees to receive aid, and musicians also helped create and generate financial aid through benefit concerts and programs. Second, even when the goal of aid is not musical in nature, music develops as a side effect of that aid. When people's physical and material needs are met, even partially, then musical activities can merge. Using these two different relationships, we can describe the hidden effects of aid on musical communities in times of crises. Known for its opulence and international scene, Shanghai was nicknamed the Paris of the East. The city had a flourishing film scene, thrilling nightlife, and booming businesses, a few of which were Jewish-owned. In 1937, the Japanese took over the Chinese-controlled parts of Shanghai, but the internationally controlled parts of Shanghai remained lively, facing more intense political difficulties after Japan struck Pearl Harbor in 1941. Japan then took over the international settlement and foreign concessions, declaring the British and Americans enemy aliens. That same year, Hitler pressured Japan to eliminate Jews residing in Japanese-controlled territories, including Shanghai. The Japanese authorities restricted the refugees, now stateless, to a designated part of the international settlement, known as the Hongqiu Ghetto. The ghetto and the restriction of movement marked a shift in refugee life in Shanghai. Aid was much more difficult to receive, and the conditions in the international settlement were significantly worse. Although the refugees were restricted to this area, they were able to get passes for work and other necessary engagements. Despite these difficulties, musicians worked as long as they could, and music lessons and small ensembles, like trios and quartets, were offered within the Jewish community. The Central European Jews were not the first Jewish arrivals to China or even Shanghai. Sephardic, Baghdadi, and Russian Jews already lived there. These communities helped financially to pay for food and housing for the newly arrived refugees, but could not care for the 20,000 arrivals alone. Beginning in 1939, organizations like the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, now known as the JDC, and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, known as HIAS, also had a presence in the city, providing aid both directly and by supporting community organizations, like the earlier mentioned Committee for the Assistance of European Jewish Refugees. Here on this slide, you can see the small sample of refugee aid and how both local communities and international aid fed into local organizations for the management and distribution of that aid. This aid focused on funding essential needs like acquiring housing, food, and healthcare. The JDC set up kitchens, hospitals, and vocational training to support the refugees' immediate and future needs. These funds also supported the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association School, also known as the Kadoorie School, funded by Sir Horace Kadoorie, part of the established Baghdadi Jewish Kadoorie family. The Kadoorie School hosted music lessons and concerts put on by both professional musicians and students. By funding the school and its teachers, the Kadoories and the JDC were also funding music. Music was only one way refugees coped with poor living conditions, a temporary and foreign refuge, and not knowing if their relatives in Europe were alive. Music provided a much-needed reprieve from the harsh realities of refugee life, allowing refugees to form and solidify ways to process the new conditions in ways that were essential to the community building and mental well-being of this group. Shirley Gilbert's Music in the Holocaust describes the role of music in Nazi ghettos and concentration camps, focusing on the intangible experiences and visible effects of music in these spaces. While music played an important role in the reactions and opportunities within the Jews' exile in Shanghai, it had limitations. Gilbert highlights how writings about music in the Holocaust often default to the idea of music serving as a spiritual resistance to Nazi occupation and imprisonment. She writes that, quote, while the word resistance suggests active intent, it seems more likely that music was only a small part of the coping framework and a less essential one than smuggling or soup kitchens. In Shanghai, music did not replace soup kitchens or housing, but it played a part in the bigger picture of how refugees were able to feel in control of some elements of their exile. Music also provided a reason to gather, socialize, and connect with fellow refugees, a very real impact in the day-to-day lives of those living in Shanghai. Today's two examples of music production within the Shanghai Jewish community show how choice and necessity met on the backdrop of humanitarian aid. A JDC narrative report from April 1st, 1939, highlights the social situation early in the war, noting that, quote, about 500 refugees have found jobs, but they are not permanent, except those of skilled technicians. The wages received in most cases are extremely low. Several musicians have been engaged in clubs, end quote. Musicians sustained some form of income in Shanghai, even when finding other means of employment became more and more difficult. Because 500 refugee musicians were able to maintain employment, that meant 500 more people were able to access relief, funds, and supplies. This is not to say that those musicians were not also using aid. They likely were, but their aid was to supplement a paycheck instead of replacing one. In 1941, the Central European Jewish refugees organized the Shanghai Musicians Association, known as the SMA. The SMA supported refugee musicians in acquiring and maintaining jobs, as well as collective bargaining to ensure fair payment for all refugee musicians. The organization also kept track of members' information, including their instruments and place of employment. In the archival scans here, we can also see how the addresses and places of employment were constantly changing as the refugees gained and lost employment as conditions rapidly declined in the city. So here you can see the names, the addresses, and then ages, former nation. So they were eventually stateless. So where they had come from is primarily Germany and Austria. Instrument. So you can see there are a lot of violinists, pianists. There's even a cello. And then you can see places of employment here. And you can see these marks that are handwritten. So as people were changing employment and losing employment, that was marked within the SMA records. And finally, you can see the addresses of the businesses, which were also changing and shifting over time. The SMA also put on concerts during and after the war, like the summer concerts in 1944 that took place in the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association School Garden. Although the SMA did not have local youth among its ranks, they frequently performed in the SJYA School Garden, a space funded by local philanthropy and international aid. The existence of the SJYA then supported the performances of the SMA during the war when refugees were restricted to the Hongqiu ghetto and when performance in other parts of Shanghai became more difficult. The SMA also held post-war benefit concerts like the October 1946 Musicians Association Matinee No. 2. This demonstrates yet another relationship between music and aid, music as a marketable skill for immigration. The idea of the Music Association Matinee No. 2 reads, quote, "With our first matinee, MAM No. 1, on April 28, 1946, we intend to give the Shanghai Jewish refugees an opportunity to watch and a special performance, the ability of our members. The idea of MAM No. 2, however, is to show the officials and representatives of various countries and all organizations concerned with the welfare of migration how accomplished and versatile our members are. Among us, we have conductors, instrumental and vocal soloists, ensemble musicians fit for big orchestras or small combinations, varying from good old classics to hot jazz. We also have comedians and vaudeville acts. To be frank, we admit that we purposefully invited our guests of honor in order to conceive them of the following fact. Our members will be able not only to make their living, but to continue their share to keep or even raise the standard of art and culture, wherever they might be. We sincerely hope MAM No. 2 will help our members on their way to build up a new life and a new country in a near future." This concert series then served dual purposes. It was primarily for the entertainment of the local Jewish refugee community and to provide a space for the community to come together. But this concert series was also an aid effort for the local musicians. It offered a place to showcase their talent in hopes that it would help their odds of immigrating out of China. If the musicians could secure their own visas to new countries, then more refugees could be helped later on. The extent to which this effort was successful is beyond the scope of this paper, but this further reinforces that music was a very real skill that led to employment in Shanghai and was encouraged as a means of employment to leave Shanghai. In both cases, the musicians were able to make room for their fellow refugees to access aid resources. The Shanghai Musicians Association, as mentioned, held several concerts in the garden of the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association School, known as the SJYA School or Kadori School, marking the SJYA School as a significant cultural space. Steve Hofstadt also writes about the success of the SJYA School as a cultural center, noting the breadth of curriculum and cultural activities the school hosted. The SJYA School supported general, cultural, and extracurricular activities, and it is most evident that music almost always fell into this category. Here you can see a music lesson for children, showing the choice for the school to provide musical training for the children who attended the SJYA school. The refugees constantly arranged music lessons among the more practical vocational training options, suggesting the importance of music to everyday life. Even though music was not the goal of funding the school, it was certainly a side effect. This also demonstrates agency among the refugees to decide what cultural activities were important to them. The Jewish refugees were constantly limited by resources and space, so the ability to make cultural decisions helped reinforce their ability to exert power on the world around them. Following the war, the SJYA consolidated and organized its clubs to form the Shanghai Jewish Community Center, largely composed of the local Jewish youth. The community center met in the SJYA school, further emphasizing the importance of the aid-backed school as a site for cultural activities. The Shanghai Jewish Community Center was directly funded by the JDC, with both the JDC and Community Center recognizing the JDC's involvement. in a scrapbook put together around 1947 that features the relief efforts from the JDC Far Eastern office in Shanghai, the creator wrote, quote, "In sponsoring and promoting cultural activities, AJJDC has recognized that refugees also do not live by bread alone. It has found it possible to spare resources for such work." On the page describing the Shanghai Jewish Community Center, the scrapbook specifically notes our reading room, language study, arts and crafts, and, most importantly for our talk, musical studies. This shows how music can be an afterthought listed under cultural activities, but the presence of humanitarian aid is what makes it possible. When people have their most basic needs met, they have time to engage with musical performances and music making. The Shanghai Jewish Community Center also began its own magazine titled Looking Ahead. The first page of the July 1947 installment of Looking Ahead has a dedication to the JDC, outlining both material and cultural aid that the JDC provided in the post-war era. The tangible includes the community center, a hospital, immigration services, and a dentist. This page also lists the cultural programs the JDC supplied, which includes a library, movies, and, of course, concerts. It is here, with the Shanghai Jewish Community Center, that the SJYA school and the SMA had significant interactions. The first publication of Looking Ahead, then titled What's My Name, had a small section titled Practical Music Activities, where the author notes that the interests of the community club lie in dance music rather than practical music or classical music. This blurb also notes that the audience is tired of theoretical lectures, implying that the performance of classical music must be better than people droning on about classical music. The author also dryly remarks that he is certain the music lovers in this club, who like dance music, just don't know that they are looking for this practical orchestral music. The future concert sponsored by the SMA is the perfect place to realize a love for orchestral music. This little blurb can also tell us a lot about how the youth of the Shanghai Jewish Community Center viewed different genres of music. The author believes that the community center is mainly interested in dance music or more popular music from the 1940s. Other volumes of Looking Ahead and other archival materials show that social dancing was also a significant part of the refugee life in Shanghai. The author here, though, is clearly drawing a line between the more popular dance music and the music people should like, which to him is practical or orchestral music. The evidence of such critique shows us that music was not just performed in Shanghai, but also debated and discussed. This makes for a lively musical community, something made possible only by the funding of the SJYA school and, by extension, the Shanghai Jewish Community Center. It is also notable that the music discussed in the blurb is some form of commercial music of the time, or music that led to employment in Shanghai. Professional engagements in the city often included nightclubs, hotels, coffee shops, the Shanghai Municipal Orchestra, and, for a select few, the Shanghai Conservatory of Music. It is not a coincidence that these are also the music genres being promoted in the community center. They were simply popular genres that people in Shanghai paid to attend. Here are two ways that music and aid interact are made visible. On one hand, the refugee musicians are supporting themselves by performing music, with the Shanghai Musicians Association sponsoring a concert. This allows these musicians to get paid for their work and stretches aid further. On the other hand, the sponsorship of a physical space of the SJYA school made engagements like this possible. The space not only provided a venue for the musicians, but also for the community to gather to listen to those musicians. While music is the event that summons folks to a space, the active community engagement is where music can make a noticeable impact and allow groups to process emotions together. This was important for the Jewish refugee community in Shanghai because musical gatherings allowed them to feel a sense of normalcy and togetherness, even though there were language, age, and cultural differences within the group. The second publication of Looking Ahead contains a review of the Shanghai Musicians Association program that the first volume mentions. This concert, as promised, included a variety of music genres from classical orchestral music to waltzes to a jazz concert. Because many refugees were immigrating and repatriating, the ensemble options were dwindling. The review notes that musicians had previously played in different bands in Shanghai. With this performance, the SMA also selected its own program, in part because it was not directly funded by an aid organization. There is no influence to perform specific pieces or songs to convey specific messages, like directly funded groups experience. Notably, the following program was not outwardly Jewish in nature. Only one composer, Emil Waldteufel, was Jewish. The music was primarily instrumental, and it is unlikely the vocal works were sung in Yiddish. These musicians likely selected the music that enabled their employment in Shanghai: classical orchestral music and popular jazz. The mix of genres in this program also indicates that the refugee musicians were skilled at and commercially successful in both. This 2.5-hour program received glowing reviews from Looking Ahead, and it even garnered a request for more young people to attend future concerts, a request many current-day musicians are likely all too familiar with. Let's take a listen to what this program might have sounded like. Some of the songs are approximated because the review only described the genre of music, not specific song titles. The descriptions will be highlighted in pink on the slide, and the corresponding text of the piece will be highlighted in pink on the volume. So feel free to read along as we listen. The first piece we have is the piece Light Cavalry, composed by Franz von Suppe, which the review notes was, quote, an excellent introduction to the concert. Second was La Pétanue Waltz by Emil Waldteufel, another orchestral work. Third was Souvenir de Sarasate by W.H. Plotstock. The band leader, Mr. Hans Baron, performed this work, which is a violin solo with a Spanish theme. Fourth were 3 sung waltzes by a Mrs. Rosal Olbach-Gerstel. Today, I will only play part of the waltz Voices of Spring by Johann Strauss, which is a close estimation to what could have been performed. Next were 2 Chopin pieces for cello. I have selected the third movement of Chopin's Cello Sonata in D minor, which was not explicitly listed, but creates the appropriate mood for this program. This was performed by a Mr. Walter Joachim, a famous cellist in Shanghai who also played 14 other instruments, further demonstrating the versatility of the musicians that were active and performing in the city. Following Mr. Joachim was a brief intermission. A jazz concert then closed out this program, with the type of jazz being described as American hot swing. I have chosen Sing Me a Swing Song by Ella Fitzgerald because it replicates the most notable part of this jazz concert. The vocalist, Mrs. Stella Lazarus, very popular in Shanghai, showed us that one doesn't have to be in the USA to be able to enjoy hot swing.
Give me a song that's robust, feeling the way I am.
Hopefully, this sample program gives you an idea of part of what the refugee musicians perform to maintain employment and develop community. While it would be unlikely to perform this exact concert today, several of the classical orchestral works are being programmed in the 21st century. This concert was made up of standard orchestral repertoire, so standard orchestral training was, and today, remains employable. While the program does not explicitly list the jazz tunes, it is likely that they were from some form of standard repertoire. Classical orchestral music and jazz were not the only genres of music performed in Shanghai, but they were the most marketable genres that allowed people to both keep jobs through parts of the war and provide entertainment for fellow refugees. In conclusion, music and aid were intertwined in various ways in Shanghai. Although not explicitly funded like the JDC's later efforts in displaced persons camps, local and global aid helped make a music scene possible. The efforts and success of the refugees in organizing the SMA also helped extend the reach of aid to people who were unable to find any form of employment. Although this impact was likely minimal in the long run, allowing more people to access aid is something else that music can do to make essentials more accessible. So, through the sponsoring of schools and community centers, aid also gave music a space to live. Refugees chose to support the production and performance of music time after time, one of the few decisions the refugees could make. This, in turn, serves as a part of the coping structures refugees were able to build while living in a foreign country for a temporary but unknown amount of time, whilst simultaneously handling the trauma of their escape from Europe. Music certainly cannot solve all problems, but it can be a load-bearing wall for refugees to process what they have been through. Thank you so much for your time, and if you have questions following the chat and following the Q&A, please feel free to email me here at my OSU email. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenna. That was actually a lot of fun. And very interesting. So thanks for sharing. Do you want to? There you go. Great. I was going to ask you. We have some questions, and we're opening it up now for questions. As a reminder, your microphones are turned off, and we take the questions via the Q&A function. We have a number of questions. I wanted to start though with one of mine. How did you come to this topic?
The Jews in Shanghai, or the music of the
music
Jews in
piece of it,
Shanghai?
yes.
Okay, so this is a really fun story. My senior year of college, I was really interested in kind of reconnecting to my Chinese heritage. And I was also insistent that I should start reading more serious books. And I picked up The Last Rose of Shanghai. And it was about a German Jewish pianist who had made his way to Shanghai and fell in love with a Chinese jazz bar owner. And I read the book and it was great, and it kind of lived in my head for a while. And when I got here to Ohio State, I had come for a completely different project. I was actually working in the Appalachian traditions of the United States. And I pitched this project because I was like, were there Jews in Shanghai? That's crazy. And then I was thinking, were they musicians? So I just kept Googling this, and it was like living in my head. And all the Google results were like, yes, it's true. There were a lot of musicians, and there are books being written about this. So I proposed it to my advisor, and she was like, wow, that's such a cool project. Let's see what the resources are out there. So I was able to find, of course, tons of resources of programs and concerts that were being put on before, during, and after the war. So yeah, it all went down to deciding to pick up that book from Amazon Kindle Unlimited.
That's great. It's great. First question I'm going to ask you from the audience was something I was thinking of as well. Were instruments available to the musicians in Shanghai, or did they bring them with them? And the person says they're having trouble imagining that they were like a cellist or bass player was carrying instruments in the long trek to Shanghai.
Yeah, so many of the musicians did not bring their own instruments. Some of them who came a little bit earlier, more closer to that 1938 era, they were able to bring some instruments. There's a clarinetist who was actually, he was the second chair clarinet of the New York Phil until very recently. And when he was on a ship, put a band together on the ship, rehearsed on the boat, and they had their instruments from Europe and then were able to perform in club engagements in Shanghai. But there were music shops in Shanghai. A popular one was Lyra, and I believe the daughter or granddaughter of the owner of Lyra is in New York City. So she has done some of the work with the New York Philharmonic to describe what that was like. But there were also music shops that were in the city because Shanghai was fairly separated from the European side of the war. They, of course, had the Pacific War was going on in the Second Sino-Japanese War. But some people were able to purchase instruments from these shops, and recordings and staff paper were all being sold there. So yeah, it was kind of a mix, but primarily it was instruments that were in Shanghai or able to be imported.
Very interesting. So this may be something that you can answer that you came across in your research, or maybe not. Were there any organized networks to get musicians and artists out of Central Europe and to the Japanese occupation zone? Did you come across anything?
Out of Europe into Japan?
Yeah.
There is, I'm sure many of you have heard of Mr. Sugihara, who was that's like one of the big Europe to the east, to East Asia stories. Mr. Sugihara, sorry, I don't study Japanese, I'm only on the
Sugihara.
Chinese. Sugihara.
Sugihara. Yep.
He was writing visas to Japan, and visas regardless of if people qualified. He just was helping people get out, I believe primarily in Germany. And a lot of refugees were able to get then from Kobe, Japan into Shanghai. So that was another route that refugees were able to take. So that was that relationship. But then once they were in Shanghai and in 1941, when the Japanese created the ghetto, there was also very much an organized effort that required the specifically newly arrived Jewish refugees to move into the international settlement. It was only for stateless refugees, which kind of umbrella covered all of the refugees from 1938 and onward, but it left the existing Jewish communities like the Russian Jews and the Sephardic Jews, it left them alone.
Okay. Looking to see, there are a lot of questions. I'm trying to connect some of them. Actually, this isn't a question, but I'll mention it here. And obviously, just so you know, so the audience knows, we will send any questions that we weren't able to get to, as well as comments to Brenna afterwards, so she can also write to you. But this one's interesting. The granddaughter of the owner of Lyra, a music store in Harbin, is on the call listening. So she'd love to be in touch. So we'll pass that on to you so you can be in touch later. Were there any Jewish-owned music shops? And if so, did they make or import instruments?
I have not found a ton of evidence outside of the Lyra shop. So I'm not sure if they were specifically Jewish owned or what the ownership looked like, because it was such an international scene. But that's definitely something I am looking into as I continue to go through archives, especially the advertisements for where things are has been helpful. So if I come across any of that, I'll let you know.
Okay. Did any Jews integrate Chinese themes into their music?
It was far less common. So there are some Jewish refugee communities, and so Shanghai was one of them, where the Jews did not integrate to the local society. So Jewish and Chinese contact, while it absolutely happened, didn't seem to happen in a very significant way. There are some marriages between European Jews and local Chinese, but it wasn't super common. This is in part because of how Shanghai was set up, right? So Shanghai was set up into these foreign concessions, which was how China handled losing the first Opium War to the British in the 1800s. So these concessions were actual like plots of land set out in Shanghai that said, okay, all British citizens can live here. All American citizens can live here. All Russian and French, etc. And it set up this system called extraterritoriality. So the people that lived in these areas were not tried in Chinese courts. They were tried as their own citizens. So if a British resident committed a crime, and then the Chinese government was like, "Hey, you can't do that," they would then have to be tried by British courts. And that division, that specific segregation of different nationalities, really prevented some intermingling. So a lot of the Chinese stayed in Chinese areas and in fact weren't even allowed in some of the concessions. I found concerts in the French concession where the Chinese residents were not even allowed to go to the parks to hear it. So there wasn't a ton of overlap. There's a little more overlap in the jazz scene. Andrew Jones' Yellow Music, fantastic book, like foundational book about the kind of interculturation of jazz and Chinese preferences, because you hear Chinese sounds come into the jazz a little bit, and you hear Chinese popular music take in a little bit of jazz, but not so much in the Jewish community.
Okay, interesting. Could you talk a bit more about what the amateur music in the SJCC was like?
Yes, I have found such fun programs and advertisements in the Shanghai Jewish Community Center. There were a lot of amateur bands that were playing for Purim dances. So there was a course of music at those events. And I found a call for a harmonica ensemble where the youth were getting together I don't know what songs were being played. I have not found any programs. I doubt they would even have printed formal programs to say, here's our harmonica ensemble. But there were harmonica ensemble meetings happening in the community center for anyone. So if there were no instruments or if they couldn't find instruments, if that wasn't their focus, they could take a harmonica on some of the papers called mouth organ and just start going some of their favorite tunes.
Great. We also have another question. Oh, it just jumped on me. Someone's very curious about what the sheet music circulation looked like in these communities. And did you have a chance to look into that at all?
Sheet music is actually one of the hardest things to find in this with this research. A lot of the evidence we have is these programs. So presumably the Shanghai Musicians Association would have been keeping sheet music that is just recirculated every time. And the Shanghai Municipal Orchestra would have had a lot of that music. It's likely that for jazz tunes and charts, one can assume a lot of it was probably handwritten or just kind of like just the charts with the chords in them, chord charts, instead of like sheet music notated. I have found some personal sheet music of refugees who are maybe like writing their own tunes or transcribing some songs, but it's likely that the non-orchestral music was probably done a lot by ear.
Okay. There were also dancers among the artists, right? And the question is, did you find references to that in the JDC archives or in the other archives that you researched?
Yeah, so the dancers are oftentimes grouped up with the musicians because a lot of what I've just talked about for music can also be said for dance, right? And art, right? So these things are all kind of coexisting together under this umbrella of cultural activities. There was a ballet, there was a dance studio, in Shanghai by I believe he was a Russian dance master. So there were dance programs for like youth dance, and there was of course a lot of social dancing. The looking ahead, the cat magazines have a lot of like, oh, there's a dance tonight, or come to our dance next week. And then there are of course groups playing, oftentimes like amateur bands. But I don't have any specific names or specific companies that were in Shanghai, but there were dance studios and people were dancing a lot.
Great. Let's see, a couple of new ones. Um, one sec. Couple of comments. I'll be sending these to you of people who sending these to you. People who have connections, so it'll be interesting for you to
Fantastic.
see them. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
So I'm just looking to see. Oh, where were the concerts performed during the war? While the war was still going on?
Some of the concerts were in the SJYA school garden. So some of those were still happening. The SJYA school has a really complicated history in Shanghai as well. It had to move a few times, especially so it did not start in the international settlement Hongqiu ghetto area. It moved addresses and eventually was kind of settled there, as the refugees were no longer allowed to freely move throughout Shanghai. It's also important to note that the Shanghai ghetto was not comparable to European ghettos. It was a physical restriction and it was much harder living conditions, still very, very difficult to live in. But it did not have the brutality of the European ghetto. So that's an important distinction to make between the two. So that was a lot of the performances. There's also the Lyceum Theater that saw a lot of performances. That was more on the Shanghai Municipal Orchestra side, which there were several Jewish refugee musicians who were employed by the Shanghai Municipal Orchestra. But so some of those theaters stayed open. Once when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, that's when so much changed in Shanghai because they could declare Americans and British and any of the allies enemy aliens. So it was difficult for the JDC to get aid into Shanghai as well, because Laura Margolis, who was like the Shanghai person for the JDC, her collection and her records are fantastic. They're great. She really shows how they had to reroute the money through a Swiss bank instead of an American one because American banks were no longer allowed to operate in Shanghai, right? So there's still some performances in those theaters until that kind of crackdown of the Japanese, especially because a lot of the bands were American. The jazz bands that were performing were American. The United States had people on tour in Shanghai, and yeah, so I think that answers the question.
Think so. Okay, let's do one or two more.
Yeah.
Were the students, since you were just talking about the SJYA, right? SJYA.
Yes. Yes.
Were the students primarily Jewish children, and were the schools supported with aid during the time by JDC? Were they mainly Jewish institutions?
Yes. Yeah. This particular school was Jewish founded for Jewish children. There were some other earlier in the war, so before things started like really closing in, there were like American schools that people sent their children to. Jewish children also went to American schools. Chinese children also went to American schools sometimes, depending on like wealth and class level, of course. So there were some other options, but the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association School, more commonly known as the Kadoorie School, was specifically Jewish. They also had religious and cultural activities there as well. So there are a lot of Hanukkah, Purim, festivals, and performances there as well. And those were also directly aid backed.
Okay. And again, lots of good comments that I think you're going to find really interesting.
So exciting.
Let's see, we'll find our last question. Can you comment on the impact of the primarily Jewish refugee musicians on the development of a strong classical music tradition in China?
Yes, so that is kind of what the bigger dissertation project looks like, right? So I am a PhD student, of course, so this is a very, very small section of a much larger dissertation. Um, China as a nation right now is also starting to recognize these contributions by Jewish refugee and Jewish musicians. But I believe, and I'm working on making the case, that they were extremely influential in the development of classical music in Shanghai and later China. So Beijing, Peking at the time, and Shanghai were the two big cultural centers in China that had music conservatories like this. So there were tons of Jewish refugees and Jewish refugees of a different era, Russian Jewish uh, instructors in the Shanghai Music Conservatory, so that they influenced the first generation of Chinese performers, Chinese composers, conductors, and it was all in this very German and Russian style of music instruction, right? So it kind of trickles down from the Jews being the first teachers impacts how Chinese music, the classical music scene today, right? So if you're teaching your first generation, they're going to keep passing on those lessons. It gets a little bit tricky around 1949 and kind of through the 70s with the communist revolution, of course, because there's a big push to get anyone who's not Chinese, which like the barbarians is kind of the term, out of China. So this didn't discriminate by religion or nationality. It was pretty much anyone that wasn't Chinese. There's a big push to get China for China, right? You see these kinds of nationalist developments. And China also struggles with figuring out what parts are Chinese and what parts are European or barbarian influenced, right? So a lot of decisions are made there that cut off some of those lines of instruction. But I do think that it's still heavily influenced by the Jewish refugees, especially the music production capabilities.
Very interesting. I'm going to thank you again, Brenna. This has been great. Thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Today's webinar was recorded and will be available on the JDC Archives website in about 2 weeks. You can also find recordings of many of our other past public programs there. Our next webinar will take place on May 4th, and it's part of this same webinar series. Tracy Slater will give a lecture on the Kobe Passage, Jewish refugees in Japan, and the hidden history of the Holocaust's most surprising escape. Please note, this is not at our usual time. It's at 7 p.m. Eastern, so it's a little different for those of you who are regulars of ours. If you'd like to stay informed about upcoming events, we invite you to sign up for our e-newsletter. You will find a link, should find the links in the chat. You can look on our website as well. We look forward to welcoming you back for future programs. And thanks again, Brenna. This was really great and a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for hosting me.